Good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming out to Soho. This is actually a totally new format for us. We felt that a lot of the issues around marketplace and network effects businesses are, of course, quite specific. And what better person to start this series off with than the man sitting next to me here, Ed Wray, founder and former CEO and chairman of Betfair. Obviously, no need to introduce Betfair. I think most of you will know about it as a business that really lives up to that much abused word of disruption. I mean, truly a disruptor in the sports betting industry. Fundamentally changing it by letting people take both sides of a transaction. Fundamentally enlarging it. We just had a kind of a chat about that concept. I'll let Ed introduce himself for a bit. First of all, thanks a lot for joining us. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how you ended up disrupting the sports betting industry and carrying around a bookmaker's coffin around the city.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. So look, I can't believe I was prepping for this today. I started work on Betfair 18 years ago, which in a tech environment is, I think, 2 to 3 generations ago. So it feels like a very long time ago. To put it into context, technology in those days, on a Saturday afternoon, which was our busiest time of the year, busiest time of the week, you had to plug your laptop, or if you had a laptop, I'm not sure you did in those days, but you plugged it into a dial-up modem, and if you were lucky, you got about 10 to 15K of download speed. So those days seem like a long time ago, but it was fun. My background, I was an engineer at university. I then sold out and went and became an investment banker. And that gives me a chance to rejig my joke that I'm about one of the only people who sold out of banking and went into bookmaking and thought they'd stepped up in the world. But I basically, I mean, in 1998, I guess, everyone seemed to have a dot-com idea, and if you didn't, there was something sort of socially wrong with you. I wasn't looking to do this. I met Andrew, who I founded it with, and it just seemed like a really interesting idea. I've always been mad about sport. And he started explaining the idea to me, and so in 1999 I quit my job and decided to start working it. And obviously we did a lot of good things. We were quite lucky. We raised our first round of funding in February 2000, I think 10 days before the market crashed. So from a gambler's point of view, best to be lucky than smart, I guess. So we started. We didn't know very much. We tried to raise money from lots of institutions. Every single one of them turned us down. And so we literally started with a friends and family round, and we did 3 friends and family rounds, and that was basically it. So that was 18 years ago. I then stayed with the business for 13 years, went from literally 2 men in a serviced office in South Wimbledon, and then we floated it in 2010. I chaired it for a bit as a public company, and now I left the business about 5.5 years ago. So I'm nothing to do with the business now. I'm still a shareholder, but I have nothing to do. So I can probably speak reasonably freely about it.
Fantastic. That's what we look forward to. Okay. Great. One of the things we talked about before is obviously the concept of liquidity is one that's well understood, at least at a high level. And I was fascinated to hear that you knew from the beginning that what you were embarking on was absolutely fundamentally a liquidity-based business. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what we were trying to do, was we were a platform and we had people on both sides, and we knew that our whole business required, revolved around this person being able to deal with this person. And Andrew, who, was, I've got to be honest, he was the sort of the brains behind the original concept. From the very beginning, his prototype built in a product that maximized liquidity. So we recognized very quickly, as in financial markets, that money is essentially a fungible object. So if you had two or three different people looking to back the same football team at the same price, one was doing it, one wanted to do it for £10, one wanted to do it for £50, one wanted to do it for £100. We could present that as someone wanting to do it for £160, and then on the other side, someone didn't have to want to take 10 or 50 or 100. They could come in and take 25 or 75 or whatever. And he built that in from the very beginning. He then built lots of other things in which said, look, if you are looking to back Roger Federer in a tennis match, although clearly Roger Federer was not playing in those days. But if you're looking to back Roger Federer in a tennis match against Rafa Nadal, somebody who was taking the other side of that was saying, I don't think Roger Federer is going to win, or actually the same thing they're saying is, I think Rafa Nadal is going to win. And so all of these, in a gambling context, in a betting market context, all of those things were linked together. So from the very beginning, we built in some quite smart algorithms that filled in the spaces in the market. So in other words, if somebody came in to back Roger Federer, even though there wasn't someone who thought they were saying, I don't want to back him, there was someone saying, oh, that allows me the chance to back Rafa Nadal. You take that one stage further in a football match, if someone wants to back Chelsea and somebody wants to back Arsenal, then actually that allows somebody else to come in and back the draw, even though nobody is explicitly saying, I'll offer you a price on the draw. And you can carry on building that mass up. And so right from the very beginning, our prototype had that in. And we realized that the way you won this market was you had to be the most liquid, and you had to maximize the chances of people being able to get their business done. And as soon as you started putting restrictions in, like I've got to match you exactly with that person, you were minimizing, or not minimizing, but not maximizing their chance of getting business done. And so, we set out to do that. We improved it going forward, but our whole ethos was very much liquidity was what would make us win.
And one of the things you talk about is horizontal versus vertical liquidity. I'd love for you to expand on that concept.
So what I mean by that is we realize that if you are a new customer coming in and you wanted to have a good experience, you wanted to place a bet, you came to a market, you had to have the opportunity to place a bet of particular size in that market. So to begin with, we very deliberately restricted the number of markets that we offered. So, for example, in a football match, we would offer one market who's going to win the match. Now, even in those days, you could look at lots of other bookmakers would say, who's going to be the first goal scorer, what's the correct score going to be, who's going to be winning at half time, etc., etc. But those, to me, that's horizontal liquidity. So you've got lots of different markets. We said that we will start with one market, and we'll only move aside from that market when that first market gets to a critical mass. Now, we didn't know what that critical mass was, but after a period of time, you can sort of say, okay, that market now is sort of self-sustaining. And when that got to that level of liquidity, then we would say, okay, now we can introduce a second market. We were worried if we did that too early, that we would dilute the liquidity, and neither of them would get to critical mass. And then the people that come in can't get the bet place, they want to get placed, so they go away. We followed that quite closely. I used to have this concept, if any of you've played backgammon, the concept of the doubling dice in backgammon. And the way that you grew this was, we knew that there were people sitting on the sidelines. If you could come onto Betfair and you could get £50 matched, we knew there was someone sitting on the sidelines who was going, well, I really want to have a £100 bet, and unless I have my whole £100, I'm not going to play. And so we would keep building it, and then as soon as we got that average size up to 100, then suddenly we knew that person came in. When that person came in on the other side, it there enabled somebody who said, well, I want to have 150 on the other side. So you sort of were growing them lockstep, but very important to keep growing it in a focused way, because what we didn't realise, we didn't know where those, was there someone sitting there who wanted to have £1,000? Yes. Was there someone who sitting there who wanted to have £10,000? Yes. Was there sitting there someone who wanted to have £100,000? Yes. And we experienced all of those. The biggest bet I think we ever took was about £1 million or something. Right. But at some point you're going to stop, and we didn't have to get to $1 million before we started going horizontally. But you want to make sure that for most people when they come in, they get a good experience. I
guess you kind of know it when you see it, when you get there, and you kind of feel for liquidity in a particular vertical.
Yes, and it's really hard. I mean, obviously, as you start doing markets, you start to develop metrics, and you can see quite quickly, how quickly does the market form. So, contrary to popular opinion, we never seeded any of our markets. So we absolutely had, we spent time with people and encouraged them to seed them, right. But we never used any of our capital to seed them. But some of the metrics we would look at is you put a clean market screen up. By definition, every single screen when you start is blank. And then we would say to people, how quickly did the market form? How quickly did it form tightly? How quickly did liquidity get to a certain level? We used to show people the volume of bets that we'd done. That again was interesting because it demonstrated to people that activity was happening. And again, on a liquidity-based business, there are two things I think that matter. One is the depth of the market, and one is effectively, if you like, the sort of speed of the market, the momentum. In other words, how quickly is trade happening? Because when you come in and look at it in a snapshot, you might see prices moving around, and obviously, that's telling you that something's happening. So very important to communicate to people that there's lots happening, because if people think there's lots happening, they'll get involved. They get involved, somebody else gets involved, and the thing becomes self-fulfilling.
Absolutely. I guess it's kind of a velocity concept. It's in some markets it's a kind of a time to fill, time to sell concept, which we certainly see as important over and over again. And I think this concept of vertical versus horizontal liquidity is something that you also see at a kind of a macro level, where people are obviously very focused on addressing a big market, and sometimes they mistake that for having to be horizontal day one. And I think that's one of the big mistakes we see people make early on, and so they never get to real liquidity in a vertical area.
I think with the benefit of hindsight now, looking back, we had a lot of things going for us that we didn't realise at the time. And it's going to sound a bit odd, this, but we couldn't operate in lots of countries around the world. In particular, we couldn't operate in the US. And I think so many people, when they start a business, sort of feel that they have to be in the US. And I'm not saying you don't, depends on your business. But for us, we couldn't go in there. So actually, it wasn't a distraction at all. We were regulated. It was quite difficult to operate in lots of different countries. So actually, we just were forced to focus in our home territory, as it were. And whether we would have had the discipline to do that if we'd have been able to go in lots of different countries, I don't know, genuinely.
Right.
But we didn't have that ability, so the discipline was imposed upon us. And I think that helped us sort of get to that religious focus, if you like, on that. The other one that actually helped us quite a lot was we were not able to market in a lot of different places. So we couldn't go and spend a lot of money on television, places like that. We were very restricted into where we could go. Where we could go was in print, and we very deliberately in print went to small distributions but high propensity to convert. So the number one place that we advertised, and for a very long time, it may even still be true to this day, the most successful publication we advertised in was the Racing Post, which had a complete distribution across the country of 100,000 people. So you'd think readership of 100,000, that's not a particularly interesting title to go into, but when you think about those people, the propensity to convert those readers to our customers was very high, because it was the most expensive newspaper, still is, I think, that you can buy. Mm-hmm. And you didn't really buy the Racing Post unless you were interested in sport and probably therefore betting. Right. So it was very, very fertile for us in terms of conversion.
And maybe it's worth just expanding on the reasons why you couldn't go into the US and couldn't advertise on TV. I mean, fundamentally, you weren't actually allowed to from a regulatory perspective, correct, which in the US, hasn't really changed yet. Whereas, of course, now when you turn on the TV, all you can see is basically betting ads, right? So yep. I think it's interesting how that has completely changed.
That changed for 2005, from memory, I think, when the Gambling Act came in. And again, perfect timing for us, because at that stage we were ready now to sort of really put our foot down and to sort of hoover up. Again, one of the things about a liquidity-based business and the exchange was that, therefore, number one is always going to be multiples bigger than number two, is going to be multiples bigger than number three, etc. We were very clearly number one. We were pretty sort of rigorous about keeping tabs on how we were doing relative to other people, and maintaining our multiple of how much bigger we wanted to be. I couldn't say that at the time, but I can probably say it now, of how much bigger we wanted to be than the number two. And it's very hard to catch up if you haven't got that framework, if you can't suddenly go and throw money at the problem in terms of lots of advertising or whatever. The only thing you can really do if you can't advertise aggressively is try and undercut. But if you try and undercut, there's no point. Our charge was commission. Undercutting is pointless if you can't get the trade done in the first place. And so liquidity for us became not only obviously made our business more efficient, became a really big barrier to entry, and then that transformed into a whole scale issue, which then allows you to really control the game.
Right. Actually, the Racing Post brings me to an interesting topic, which is horse racing. And I wrongly assumed, I just learned before this chat, that horse racing was always kind of the sport that got you to a dominant position, and it was not actually what you started with, but it then kind of rapidly became a very important driver. So it would be great to talk a little bit about how that happened and what's different about horse racing.
Well, so when we started, and the original business plan, which to be honest resembles a work of fiction when you look at it now. But,
most business plans do.
Most business plans do. But we were going to do big horse races. So the first market we ever did was the Oaks back in 2000. At the same time as the Oaks, Euro 2000 kicked off, and we were so much more excited about doing international football than we were about doing, big races. So we were going to do the Oaks, and then we were going to do, trying to think what the order must have been. Then Ascot would have come, and then we would, so we had sort of different things coming. But very quickly, we got rung up by customers sort of saying, well, this is great, you did the Oaks and you're doing Ascot, but why aren't you doing Yarmouth on Monday? So, we thought, well, do people really want to bet on this? Our view was that they wouldn't. Very quickly, we had lots of people who rang us up and said, we want to do racing. And the challenge for us in doing racing, we realised afterwards the reason that people really want to do racing is because that's where there is the most diverse range of opinions. So, on our exchange, we got a trade when two different people had different opinions, and they could basically try and monetize their opinion. So if everyone thought the same thing, you're never going to get any opinion. Obviously, if you have a horse race, if you have a tennis match where you've got, or a football match where you've got sort of Manchester United playing, Brentwood. Apologies to any Brentwood fans in the room. No one's really going to think that Brentwood's a good bet. If you then, but in racing with a handicap system with different, there was just a lot more interest in the different sort of value concept, I guess, which we hadn't really thought about in much detail. But one of the beauties was that very quickly, all we had to be, we realised that we had to determine, was there an official event, and could we determine the official outcome? And if there was, then we could put it on our platform, and then we could let markets form. So we were a bit sceptical. We had a young guy who was absolutely dead keen that we should do this, and so we said, off you go. You can run every market, and credit to him. He got them going, and that became the mainstay of what we were doing. It's also, the frequency. So you would look at the calendar, and through the non-summer months, there would be 3 race meetings a day, probably six races per meeting. So you'd have 18 events that would all come and go. And of course, we collected money every time we settle an event. So actually, the short lifestyle was very good for us. A race would go off, we'd settle it. People would then roll their money onto the next one. Settle, roll on to the next one, etc. So that frequency, again, really played for and helped us.
Right. So frequency, diversity of opinion, because you had multiple outcomes, not just kind of Manchester United wins, Brentford wins, or draw. Helped presumably in that kind of diversity of opinion as well.
Yes, and sort of form. So again, the Racing Post, as its name suggests, was very much a racing newspaper. Again, hard to imagine, but actually in those days, technically, none of the bookmakers would accept a single on football. Quite why, we don't know. That changed very quickly, and partly, I think, because we came straight in and said, we'll accept them. They were very worried about managing their risk. So the nice thing, we didn't have a risk position to manage, so we could therefore offer all these different things up. But there was always a lot of information, a lot of form around racing. So again, sophisticated punters, and we started with sophisticated. In our pyramid of sort of, the classic marketing pyramid, we were at the top of the pyramid, or we thought we were at the top of the pyramid in terms of a small number of sophisticated, high-value customers, rather than what we would term, the grand national customer. So there are a couple of races that really appeal to, the mass market, and we were not appealing to those. And so there was a lot of information, and because there was information, that information, whenever you have a conversation, if someone says something controversial, or they seed the debate, and then people form up on either side of that, saying they either agree with it or they disagree with it, and so you're helping to form those differences of opinion, and then we gave people the platform to monetize those.
Right. Interesting. So, I guess there is, one important part of the story, which is actually where my business partner Greg, of course, came in, which is the acquisition of Flutter. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that you got turned down by all the institutional venture capital firms at the time. There was another company in town which was quite successful at raising money, and I guess through a few attempts, ultimately copied what you were doing. So it would be great to kind of get a sense for how you started talking to them, why you ultimately decided to acquire them, and how it all turned out.
So when we started in late '99. We tried to raise money through late '99, early 2000, failed, raised it from individuals, and we sort of got the sense that there was someone else out there doing it. And our heart sank when they launched about a month before we did, I think, in terms of, Flutter, this is what we're doing. Interestingly, and I'm sure Greg won't mind me saying it, but in terms of their focus on product, I don't think they were focused on liquidity. Theirs was very much a bulletin board type of approach. Funny enough, I've said to Josh, who I worked with for a long time afterwards, who was the founder of Flutter, in many ways what they did was way ahead of its time, because it would have suited today's social media type environment much better than it suited the environment back then. But they didn't have the ability to maximize liquidity, and so that was a big change for us. So we shot out of the blocks, and we were, very quickly became the sophisticated, serious punters' destination of choice. But what we did realise is that they had some very smart people. They were well capitalised, and we could see that they were going to start copying what we did. They tried to undercut us on commission, and I vividly remember the conversation in the office about, should we follow? And then we just realised if we follow, we only lose, because then they'll just cut again, and eventually they'll drive us out of business that way, because we didn't have very much money. So we had to hold our nerve there and be slavish about our product and about making sure that it worked. But eventually the two of we all knew, I think, number one, number two, number three, that comes like that. And so we put number one and number two together. And our premise was, we thought there'd be some overlap. So we thought, well, if we're doing 12 and they're doing 3, that would be 15. And actually afterwards, there'll be a bit of overlap. So instead of that, it'll be, 13, let's say. Actually, we put 12 and 3 together, and pretty much next week we were doing 20, or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. But basically, it's that whole point, because we put it together. Deeper markets enabled more people to put in more. Some people who weren't betting yet came in, and the whole thing just took off. And Greg and I were talking earlier. I mean, I think we then, from that moment on, we grew at sort of 15% a month for about 18 months. So it was really sort of hold on to your hats time. But in the same time, what we did is if one had been 3 or 4 times bigger than 2, and there was a sort of 3 that was down here, suddenly now 1 became 20 times bigger than 2.
Right.
Where the numbers are. So much so that actually it got referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission as was. And we managed to persuade them that they shouldn't look at it. But that whole concept of relative market share, and I'm smiling because one of our board members who came up with that, and it was a really valuable piece of advice for us in terms of always remembering that 1 to 2, you've got to maintain that differential. You don't really care what happens with 2 and 3, but you need to maintain 1 to 2 at sort of, in our case, had to be a minimum of 10x.
10x.
Yeah.
Right. And that was pre-acquisition as well as post?
Yeah, I mean, so pre-acquisition, we weren't 10x. And in truth, we weren't sophisticated enough to think about those metrics then. Post-acquisition, we went to more than 10x. And then, when you think about it, it's a really hard thing to maintain because, the number 2 guy adds $1 of revenue, you've got to add at least 10. And we kept that. Well, we kept it. Obviously, it started more than 10, but we kept it above 10 pretty much the whole time. And that's at that point that you sort of you've got the wherewithal to respond if number 2 does something smart. You can imitate it if you have to, and you shouldn't be afraid to imitate it. But it also knows that ultimately, you are the conversation, and you can sort of make sure that you control where the customers go.
Absolutely. Yeah, fascinating. 10x is certainly that's a high bar for knowing that you have won, but it certainly works. You mentioned earlier this concept of the kind of the customer pyramid and where you were positioned kind of towards the top. One fascinating concept, I think, around Betfair and other businesses kind of that are more exchange-based is the concept of ecosystems. And I think what Betfair did relatively early is allow algorithmic traders to access the business via APIs and essentially kind of use computing power to provide liquidity and obviously benefit from it as well. So it'd be great to kind of play that story out a bit and see what happened.
Yeah, I mean, so I know it's in the original business plan. We had this sort of concept, we had the concept of our marketing pyramid, and we were always going to be at the top of that, or what we thought was the top in terms of small number of relatively high value customers. Actually, what transpired is we thought we were at the top, and the more we went on, we realised that actually we were probably further towards the middle, and that there was still a lot to play for above us the whole time. in terms of access, and again, I don't think we were sophisticated enough, to be honest, to begin with, to think about the concept of the ecosystem in the way that we came to understand it. One of our big marketing pushes was that because we weren't taking the risk, we would never turn a customer off because they were too successful. A chap who actually went on to become one of our biggest customers said to me very early on, he said, "You say winners are always welcome." He said, "I will prove to you and you'll be wanting to shut me down because eventually I will put too much strain on your ecosystem." So we like to challenge him. We said that will never happen, and actually he was right. He understood a lot more about it than we did. But we from the very early days, we wanted to, as I say, reduce the friction for people to use our system. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible, in a responsible way, obviously, but as easy as possible for people to access us, to trade, to do what they wanted to do. So the idea of doing APIs was just a natural progression because we started to see people writing, robot bots to sort of scrape the site and try and work that way. And we thought, well, rather than them doing it in an uncontrolled way, let's us build them the API. Also, by the way, very important from a tech point of view to manage that flow, because the thing that caused us a lot of stress in the early days was people who wrote bad bots hitting our site too much, and we'd either have to turn them off or we couldn't regulate them. So actually we said, look, we'll provide the environment and then we can put constraints in that environment.
As opposed to an unintended denial of service attack, essentially.
Yeah, we had. Exactly. We had plenty of self-induced problems, and we had people literally pulling plugs out that they shouldn't have pulled out, and all that good stuff. But we also did have, as we got more and more. We're at one stage, we're very much a build for peak rather than average platform, and we had people who would just write a bot that went haywire. And so, it's hard to regulate when it's just coming through your web browser because it takes everyone down with you. So instead, we then opened up the API channel. As we opened up the API channel, so we saw people using it in a way that we hadn't envisaged. And one of the big lessons that we learned very quickly was the more capacity in its broadest sense, whether that's computing capacity or sort of different opportunities from a product point of view, your customers will find clever ways of using them. Rather than us trying to second guess how they'd use them, we just said, look, we'll give you the environment. You go away and work out how you want to use it. And so that therefore brought in a lot of bigger customers, some incredibly sophisticated customers in that. And we knew, it was interesting because we knew of the existence of a few of these sort of computer syndicates around the world, and they predated the internet. These were the guys who were betting into Hong Kong, in the sort of 80s, on sort of good old-fashioned Unix systems. And eventually we found some of those, or they found us, and they started to use our platform more and more. And of course, one of those fills 100 of these. So it became a bit of a marketing challenge to make sure we could keep on filling up the hopper, as it were. And over a period of time, we then began to understand the ecosystem much better, and realised that actually our very, very most successful clients at the top, a small number of them, but a very small number of them, actually were making a disproportionate amount, making a lot more money out of providing this service than we were. And so over a period of time with pricing, we had to sort of adjust that.
Right.
But we were just keen to keep the whole thing going for as long as possible. And any liquidity-based system is the bigger it gets, the more efficient it gets. The more efficient it gets, the bigger it gets. And you want to keep that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy going for as long as possible.
So repricing, essentially, even your very biggest customers, I'm sure there were discussions where they were threatening to walk away, threatening to set up their own sites to trade amongst themselves. Ultimately, they stayed.
Most of them, we probably lost a few, but most of them did. Pricing evolved. So again, I don't quite know where we got 5% from. That was literally a number we just plucked out of the air in the early days. In fact, up until about a day before we went live, it was 4%, and then we just increased it by 25%.
That's easy money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
When nobody knew. And very quickly then we realised that was on a per bet basis, and then we had to do it on a sort of per event basis, and and then we just sort of did it. We gradually changed the way that we did it. So we came across this concept of money going round our system. Every time money moved around our ecosystem, we would then clip the ticket when it moved around, and we realised that money didn't move around until we hit the settle button on a particular market. So we refined it a bit then. We then introduced loyalty, and so we rewarded people who put more at risk through the platform. It wasn't just a pure volume game, but actually we came up with a metric which we still use today, which is how much you win versus how much you lose, therefore how much you are risking, which is actually what you want. It was an important metric for us. But yeah, we did have to then we had to introduce different levels of pricing for people. And yes, we had people who were, got very upset and said, we'll go away. And we said, that's fine. We understand that's your prerogative. And, we hope you don't. But if you do, we'll understand that your decision to do that. But we had to be true to trying to maintain the whole ecosystem and maintain it in proportion that it could continue to grow.
Right.
Because if it gets out of kilter, then it can't grow.
Absolutely. I do actually want to come back to that, but before we do, it may be worth it just talking a little bit about this concept of netting off for commission purposes, because essentially, if I understand it correctly, what you did essentially is allowing people to kind of take multiple sides or different outcomes in the same event,
Yep.
and you only pay commission on the net outcome
Correct.
within that market, essentially.
So we moved from originally when we started, it was literally on a per bet basis. So we always had this concept that we would only charge the winner, not the loser.
Right.
And that was partly, it was a marketing thing because bookmaking up to that point was very adversarial. In other words, if you were a traditional bookmaker, you won when your customer lost. So we very quickly said that we'll charge the winner, not the loser, because then it allowed us to say to our customers, we want you to win. We're on the same side as you. And it sounds like a really twee distinction, but it was unbelievably powerful that, we had customers saying, wow, first time I've ever had a betting company that wants me to win. Obviously, they didn't realise that, well, they did, but, obviously if someone was winning, someone was losing,
Right.
But it was just a psychological bit. People are happy to pay you when they've won, and you don't want to rub their nose in it and say, pay us when you've lost. So we started doing it on a winner, but on a per bet basis. But then we saw that if someone had a bet here and then they, as traders do, then hedge their position here, then we were sort of discriminating. We were charging them here and we weren't giving them relief here.
Right.
So very quickly we moved it to a net. First of all, we did it net, what we call net per runner. So it was if you had backed a particular horse and then laid it off, when the price had shortened, then we would charge you on the net. But then we realised that actually in a football match, for example, people would have different outcomes. I mentioned earlier how all the different outcomes imply something else. So we very quickly moved it to a per event basis. And as I say, that's when we introduced this. We thought about it in the concept of money moving from customer A to customer B. As customer B accepts some money, then we will basically take our commission off what they accept.
Right.
So if they're going to get 100, they got 95. They were very happy because they got 95. Now that 95 could have been 200 in and 100 out and all the rest of it. But they got money, and the person who lost money didn't pay anything.
Right. And the 5% stayed roughly all the way through with some exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, so we then realised, again, if you get down to a tennis match, for example, what happened at this point was that the bookmakers, traditional bookmakers became a lot more competitive and they started to sort of catch up. So particularly on football, so low outcome, small number of runners. In betting, there's a thing called over round per runner. So if you've got 20 horses in a race, then there's effectively a very big margin in that.
Right.
But if you've got two people playing in a tennis match, that's pretty skinny margins. And so we had to adjust it. So we had, we moved that. We said that we have a headline rate per event. So in racing it would be 5%, but in tennis it might be 2%, and then you have a discount on top of that. So we adjusted it a bit.
Right.
But we were always we were a different model to the traditional betting model, and so we kept our nerve a little bit.
That's actually an interesting one in the context of relative market share, because of course you were competing against Flutter in the early days and then against the new number 2 where you were 10 times bigger. But also you were competing against traditional betting companies to an extent, and I guess that became more and more relevant as you became bigger. So how did you think about that and relative market share?
It gets a lot harder at that point because we knew that the very successful guys, the sort of core of I think, wouldn't be able to go to a traditional bookmaker because they get turned off very quickly. So
Right.
for a lot of our customers, we knew that actually their domain was going to be exchange betting. And so that was where we were really focused on exchange betting. And the key for us was knowing that, if you wanted to come and have a bet, you came to us in the exchange environment and we were a lot better than the number 2 exchange environment. If you were a customer wanting to have, 10 grand on on the favourite at Royal Ascot, good luck trying to do that with any of the bookmakers. You're just not going to be able to do it. Particularly not if you've won, historically, because they'll know you very quickly. So we knew that we wouldn't necessarily be competitive when it came to, what I call the Grand National Punter, what we used to call the Grand National Punter. Someone who just basically wanted to put, £5 on the horse because they liked the name. We were going to struggle to compete with that, but that was never what we were really trying to do. we were very focused on, as we built this, as we built the ecosystem, and from a marketing point of view, we were very, very focused on our sort of payback time. So we didn't look at how much it cost us to acquire a customer. We just looked at how much it cost us to acquire the customer, and then over a particular cohort, how quickly that cohort paid us back in commission. And if that was so when we started, it was like about 3 months. And we thought that's just way too short. So we actually spent more money deliberately, and we knew it would get less efficient. So we were just happy to throw money at it and push it out. I mean, obviously, if you throw money at it and it doesn't go out, you keep throwing more money at it. But it would gradually go out. And I think in the end, we said, look, actually 9 months seemed to us to be a good number, because we were in a market share grab. So we wanted, time was a very undervalued commodity for us, and we focused on that quite a lot. So we were very happy to spend more money, less efficiently. That small Grand National punter, I keep calling them derogatory, but they were never really going to contribute to our payback numbers. Right. So we didn't see ourselves in those days competing head on with the traditional bookies. For a long period of time, the traditional bookies tried to fight us, tried to get us banned. That was great, because the more time they were spending trying to get us banned, the more time they weren't spending actually trying to work out how to compete with us. Right. And then that began to change, and in particular, someone like Bet365, who again is a private company, started to then just really focus on an alternative product that had different attributes, and they've obviously done very well at that.
Sure, absolutely. So coming back to the ecosystem question for a second, that's an interesting one, because you have this dynamic where you have, which you often have, where you have a number of very big players, and they need to be supported partly in the ecosystem by smaller but a larger number of smaller players. And of course, I think one of the things Betfair did very successfully is to try to level the playing field by making information accessible to the smaller players, which you had an interest in doing, whereas a traditional bookmaker wouldn't have, because fundamentally, as you said, the smaller players' loss was their gain. So I guess that was an opportunity essentially to trying to democratize. I guess there's always limits to the ability to do that, but it would be great to hear a little bit whether that actually worked.
Yeah, I mean, so the optimum ecosystem for us would be, people winning and losing, because effectively then their money goes the furthest and everyone contributes and the whole thing stays in balance. Now, as I say, you always have, we talk about 80-20, it's 95-5 or maybe even, more extreme than that. But we tried very hard for the sort of, the bigger number at the bottom to, make life easy for them. So one of the first acquisitions we did was to buy a business called Timeform, which was a racing, high premium racing information business. It had previously only been available on subscription. So we bought that business and we made all that content available for free to our entire user base. And we plumbed it, from a product point of view, we plumbed it in so that they came in and they could see it. Now, what we were trying to do there was to give people information, to give them comfort, and sort of all the tools possible to able to go and to go and bet. So that helped. We opened up the API. We encouraged third parties to build applications to trade on our platform. So, lots of people built products that actually then sort of went through Betfair, and might be an easier interface for some people, might allow them to trade in a simplistic way, or people could sort of pick and choose what they wanted. So again, we were encouraging that. As I say, we tried to make the technology as accessible as possible, both from a speed point of view and everything else. However much you do that, the guys at the other end, are also very smart. So, our most sophisticated customer worked out where we hosted and made sure he located all his servers in the cage next door.
Flash boys for betting, right?
Because he realised that would give him a tiny little advantage that some people wouldn't be able. So you're all the time trying to work out how you level the playing field, and it's a bit of an arms race. It's an arms race to people who do it with genuine intentions, and it's an arms race to people who try and abuse the system. And it's for anyone who bets now, you bet in play now. Betting in play didn't exist before Betfair came along, right? Because traditional bookmakers weren't really set up to manage that risk in real time. Very hard to do.
Sure.
Of course, we weren't managing risk, so we could say, fine, here's a level playing field. And so, we did the first in-play market, I think it was the UEFA Cup final, the Europa League, whatever it was called, between Liverpool and whoever, back in 2001. and lots of people came in, and then as you create that, you realise you've got another load of problems because, of course, the person who's putting a price on the exchange, something happens, like a goal is scored, that price at that point is clearly the wrong price, and then it's a fastest finger first. Can I take that price before he takes it off? So then you build in some protection there, you build in a time delay, and so the whole time you're moving around, and you help these people, and then it hurts these people, so you have to help them, and then these people take advantage. So it's all a case of just continually looking again at the ecosystem, all the trades. Every now and again you do something, and volume just goes off a cliff. You think that was the wrong thing to do, so you just turn it off very quickly and work out what happened. Sometimes you do something and the opposite would happen. You'd try something, you'd launch it, and then suddenly volume would spike, and you realise that something's something's working. And from a product point of view, again we got quite good in the end. Two things. One, we might have 5 different things we thought would help. We didn't really know which one was the winner. So rather than putting all our eggs in one basket and saying it's number 2, because we think that's the best one, we would develop them all to sort of 60, 70% and put them out in a sort of minimum viable product type way, and then just see very quickly which ones worked. And in a liquidity environment, that's really important because you get so much trade very quickly, and you get you can see. I mean, it's no different from a lot of businesses, but it really matters in a liquidity point of view because that comes in, and then everything else benefits as a result.
Sure, you see the results immediately. Yep. Absolutely. Did you run those experiments in a very structured and organized way from the beginning, or
No.
did you kind of start to learn that you had results, so you adjusted course?
I mean, we were completely naive to begin with in terms of
no organized A/B testing or multivariate testing going on then.
No. And those were phrases I don't think we knew what they meant for about 5 years. But we did. Yeah, we tried things, and we made lots of mistakes as you do. But no, we weren't structured in that way. We became a lot. We became a lot better. So over a period of time, we built models that would predict what a user would be like according to how they signed up. So again, we realized that if we took them through the different things you could do on an exchange that you couldn't do in a fixed odds environment. So you place a back bet, you then ask for better odds, you then place a bet on the other side, you then cash out, you place a bet in running, whatever they are. We realised after a period of time that as we took people through those, they became incredibly sticky.
Right.
If they got what we were offering. Our challenge was that for a lot of people it was quite complicated to start with. So we had to educate them over a period of time. And we developed a very good model of working out which people it was worth investing that time in, according to how they signed up, how much money they put in, what their first bet was on, even to the level of looking at how, what browser were they using, because that would tell you a lot about their relative level of tech sophistication.
Right. Fascinating. Yeah. No, I think we all kind of look back, and of course you have these moments when liquidity spikes or volume spikes, and you try to find out what actually caused it. And of course, we all talk about A/B testing, multivariate testing, but sometimes, I guess it's actually simpler than that.
Well, a lot of the time it's just exogenous, and there's nothing you've done. I mean,
Right.
and I think the other thing with liquidity we found is we would go along, we would grow, and then we would suddenly jump through a level. And that, that's my doubling dice bit again. Is that there was someone sitting on the edge of the market waiting to get involved. They couldn't get involved until we got to a certain level. We got to that level, they got involved, so this thing suddenly jumps 2 or 3 levels.
Right.
And if you go back and track our growth, if you step back and look at it on a yearly basis, it looks like it's sort of doing that. If you zoom in, you realise it goes like that, and then it jumps. And then we would know it would jump, and then we would really focus for the next month or two on just locking that in and then growing from there. Every year, our big event every year was the Cheltenham Racing Festival, which became a real point of focus for the whole business. From a technology point of view, we knew if we could get through Cheltenham, and we didn't many times, but we knew once we got through Cheltenham, we would be able to get through the rest of the year, right? Because it was that much of a sort of spike in terms of traffic and all the rest of it. We also knew that it would always be a jump up. We then, so that was a jump up every year. World Cups, European Football Championships were a jump up every other year. And you sort of worked out there were certain things that would take you to the next level. And it was a bit like a ratchet. Right. You get there, and then you should be able to lock that in and then build from there.
I do want to open up to the audience, but before we do, maybe just one additional kind of comment or question. Of course, you had, in some ways, the luxury of being profitable incredibly quickly, which I think a lot of people can forget with hindsight, despite technology costs being so much higher at that point, you raised a grand total of less than £5 million, not counting the Flutter side. And that was it, essentially. Post merger, you never had to raise additional capital, essentially.
No, I mean we started by raising £1 million. So we had some very generous friends and family, but that was never enough for us to really feel that we didn't have a problem. So very early, I mean, I was always obsessed about cash flow. And so we got it as quickly as we could to cash flow break even. We got to cash flow break even in about, from memory, I think about just under 9 months or something. And at that point, we knew that we could then sort of slowly let the sales out, knowing that we could always rein it back in. So once we proved that we could get it to cash flow break even, then we'd sort of let it go a bit further. And if it got a bit out of control, we'd rein it back in. And we sort of just gradually built it this way. But we always had to be in control of our own destiny. It was different there from a technology point of view. I mean, when we merged with Flutter, they had just spent $1 million on a storage array that stores 850 gigabytes. So you put that into context of today.
Right.
One of the biggest challenges at the time was we kept on butting up against technology limits. However much we tried to just set the bar even higher, we just seemed to just hit that threshold the whole time. We worked with Sun Systems, and we went all the way through one class of their servers, and hit the buffer, and then they said, right, I'm afraid you've maxed out on the biggest one. You've now got to change family. You change family, the sort of bus architecture, the microarchitecture is all different. You've got to start again. We broke the Sun operating system kernel. We had them on the phone saying, you've managed to break this. Just in terms of the intensity of what we're doing. We used Oracle software. We had one license for Oracle, so we were probably a completely uninteresting business from them from a business point of view, one license. But in fact, we were, according to them, their sort of third or fourth hottest, i.e. busiest installation anywhere in the world. So we were using Oracle, probably not using Oracle for what it was intended to do, but again, we were cutting edge on a lot of that stuff. And at the time, we thought technology was our biggest problem, and we kept on running into a technology headline, and we moved. With the benefit of hindsight, the biggest thing that I didn't get right at the time, was we didn't have the right people there to manage the technology and all the rest of it. So you don't realise, and when you're scaling, the people issue, I didn't realise, candidly, at the time, was as much of an issue as it was. I could only see that afterwards.
Right.
And it takes longer for those issues to manifest themselves. Technology manifests itself straight away. But actually far more damaging is if you're not bringing on the right people and continue upgrading the people, then you're going to max out. But if you're growing at 15% a month for 18 months, you have to project forward where you're going to be in a year's time and say, have I got the right people to manage that kind of stuff? Which at the time we didn't do.
Yeah, I guess 15% month over month is actually 6x in 18 months,
Correct.
Right? So it's a big number.
Yeah.
Great.
And it's fun, but it's also quite
It's
scary.
challenging, absolutely. But that's an interesting comment, that I guess technology scalability issues are really just the manifestation of the underlying issue, which was
they're the ones
people.
that hit you first, and
Right.
they're there, and they're very real, and so therefore you understandably you focus on those. But what we soon realised, when we merged with Flutter, and we sort of, as part of that, upgraded a lot of our people. And in particular, David, who came to run our technology, just had a completely different view of technology, and miraculously, a lot of our technology problems began to disappear,
Right.
because we had the right person in looking after it.
It helps.
Yeah.
So I'd love to open it to the floor if there are any questions. If anybody wants to start off. Sure. Front seat, front row.
Thank you, Ed, for a fascinating story. It's really inspiring. You talked initially about your focus on liquidity. To what extent did you think of the business initially as that which is rich in terms of network effect, and to what extent you positioned it as such to investors you pitched initially?
Maybe I'll just repeat it for the benefit of the audience. So essentially the question, if I understand it correctly, is to what extent was the initial pitch to investors, and maybe more broadly also the internal pitch, a network effects pitch?
That's exactly right. Thank you very much.
It wasn't, which is probably why we failed to raise any money from institutions, because the people we raised it from were, they were friends, they were family. That was against a backdrop of it's .com, it has to be good. February 2000, it had to be good, right? And we had a little prototype that wowed them, and that's what we raised on. So if I'm honest, I don't think we really thought about the network effects at that stage. What we realised very quickly, actually, again, just we didn't think about it, but we happened on it, and then we realised we had to lock it in, was that we were not a traditional liquidity business in the sense that you've got this side and this side. Our customers would flip between, they were both sides the whole time. So, in the same way that financial market participants are often both sides, but even more so because they were market maker, they were price taker, they were price setter, they were everything. So we were able to go out and just acquire customers and then make sure that we sort of distributed them, equally amongst the side. We didn't have to go and find this class of customer and then go and find this class of customer, which a lot of liquidity, I'm, for example, in Funding Circle now, and you've got borrowers and you've got investors, and they are mostly different people. Ours were one type. So from that point of view, that was good. And then, as I say, my sort of doubling dice is the sort of network event. I mean, our launch event, when I raised money from these fabled friends and family, I worked at JP Morgan. I could probably have raised all of the money I wanted to from the trading floor at JP Morgan. Actually, what I did is I went and I found one person on the trading floor at 10 different investment banks, people I knew. And I thought, I will put one person as a sort of advocate for what we're doing on a trading floor, because then they've got 300 people on their trading floor and they will get this straight away. So we sort of started to build our little network that way. Of course, sadly, 10 very quickly became 6 as they all merged together, which didn't help me. But so we sort of built it around a few people like that, and we encouraged people. We said to them, look, you as a customer, very few businesses were as a customer. If you say, go and get another customer, it will actually enhance your customer experience. Usually customers say, hold on, why am I going to share this great thing with somebody else? Because if I bring someone else in, we're going to have to share the spoils. Actually, this is a business that very quickly they realise, if I get somebody else in, it gets bigger, it's better for everyone, and therefore it's better for me. So for a long period of time, it was, it worked pretty well. Our most effective, and I'm sure it is in a lot of businesses, but our most effective marketing channel in terms of payback, we couldn't get it to pay back any longer than about a month, was effectively our Refer a Friend program, which is playing to that network FX business.
Starting with what was essentially a crowdfunding round, it sounds like.
Yeah, we were real pioneers.
Absolutely. New stories keep coming out. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we, as I say, don't underestimate how we were at right place, right time. Things like EIS, which, I didn't abuse, but I really sort of said to people, if this goes wrong, the government will pay half your tab. Which is true, by the way, but, it sort of was a nice selling pitch. But
absolutely. And February 2000 certainly helped as well.
Yeah.
There was another question here. Maybe we'll just make sure you get the microphone, if you don't mind.
I raised my seed round from traders at JP Morgan as well. So kind of ties into the end of that conversation a little bit, but the business model fundamentally has this chicken and egg scenario where you need customers to get liquidity and you need liquidity to get customers. So in the early stages, you obviously figured out pretty quickly how to reach your customer. But can you explain kind of how that happened and how you figured out the best distribution channel to get people to play?
So, I mean, like all, like a lot of businesses, this was a solution to a problem. It was just, a lot of customers were fed up with the experience they had when they went to, traditional betting companies. So again, come back to the point that actually we didn't have to get two different types of customers. We just had to get a customer, and they would fulfill both sides of the trade for us. So, we started through, first of all, just, people we knew would be interested in it, people would get it. So the adoption, what we used to call the adoption complexity, was quite high. So if you weren't a trader, then it was a bit complicated to understand this. A trader just got it like that. So we went to those people, bluntly. I used to participate in a few sort of illegal, probably, gambling books on trading floors and things like that, as most people did. So you just knew that there was going to be a lot of pick up there. Then quite quickly, we were very lucky actually. The Racing Post, about 3 weeks after we launched, unbeknown to us, one of the guys, one of the very, very first people who came, sadly died recently, wrote an, he used it, loved it. He was a punter. You see, the Racing Post journalists were punters. And they saw this and they absolutely loved it. And so we couldn't have wished for better following from them. So they wrote a piece, it was called Sight Unseen. In the early days of the internet, this is the latest betting site, and they wrote this thing about it, and that just generated more people. Our target was we went to a very small captive audience. I talked about the Racing Post, readership of 100,000, which is nothing, right? But I should think our conversion rate was unheard of in terms of advertising conversion, in terms of, how many of those we converted. And they got it very quickly, and they got it, and they told other people, and it got bigger. And then a stroke of luck from our side was that the bookmakers got really arsey about it, and started trying to make life difficult for us. And so they gave us lots of oxygen, and they gave us lots of publicity for free. And the more they did that, the more we used that to our advantage. But in the early days, it was, you just had to be patient. Again, come back to my vertical liquidity point. Don't try and do too much too soon. Do one thing and do it really well. And people go, wow, I love that. And then go from 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 4, and then gradually build it out. The biggest mistake we could have made would have been trying to do every horse race and every football match and every tennis match all on the platform at the same time. Because people would have gone to one and they found nothing there, they find nothing there, it's not interesting, it's a waste of time. We used, and then we focused, we had a counter on the homepage. Just said amount matched every day. Became a poison chalice in the end, but to begin with, it really helped generate, business, because it was just there. And it just went up and up and up and up. And then we moved it to amount matched over 7 days. So it was a rolling number, and you could therefore just start to track. And again, that point about giving people a view that there's a lot of happening. They come in for a point in time. You've got to tell them that they need to be here a lot, because there's a lot happening when they're not here. What I find now with any liquidity-based business that I'm involved in, I'm always saying to them, if you don't have a transaction happening the whole time, then you've got to find a reason to pull your customers back to keep them there, because if they're there, they'll see the opportunity, they'll act on it. If they're not there, they obviously can't act on it. For example, we would have a thing where, to begin with, when you logged in, we would tell you what had happened since you last logged in. So we were trying to tell people. We got rid of that quite quickly, but it helped in the early days just to convince people that they should just be there a lot more often and sort of observing. Does that answer?
Yeah. Beyond focusing on liquidity and trying not to do too much too soon, what are the key things you learned during your journey that you think are applicable to other marketplace businesses?
Beyond that, you need a bit of luck. No shortcuts. So don't be tempted to buy the wrong type of business. And it's got to grow in a sustainable way. So I think probably the biggest learning was the ecosystem and understanding that balance. We became really quite good at that. We knew nothing about it to begin with, by the way. But we began to realise that was if we got it out of kilter, then the thing would just fall over. Realising as well, I used to bore people, say, look, if we can go up one side of the mountain very fast, you can come down the other side very, very fast. And so we were paranoid about what our competitors were doing. Again, probably the concept, and Greg will laugh when I say this, but concept of relative market share, not market share, relative market share is absolutely key. And I didn't care how much of the market we had. All I cared about was how much more of the market I had than the person who was coming up behind me. That then if it's going wrong, that number will move really, really, really quickly, because you'll come down slightly, somebody else will go up slightly, and it's a double whammy. So I think that was probably it. Again, we international, that was a challenge for us. Partly there comes a point where regulation, by the way, can be very helpful, and it was very helpful for us to begin with. Then it became a problem, because we actually then wanted to go to lots of places simultaneously, and we couldn't. But ultimately, you'd always rather be in. If you're a strong player, you'd always rather be in the regulated environment than outside it. I think it was, probably those three, and also recognizing that probably the other learning was every time, if I had my time again, I would just have put more capacity on the table quicker, and not try to be cute about how much I had to spend now and when. I would just max out the whole time. Because every single time we did it, our customers surprised us at their ingenuity about how they would use it. And of course, that just reinforces the strength of the platform.
Thank you.
Question, you mentioned the people component which you guys got wrong. In terms of actually started scaling, how do you get the people component right? What are the mistakes you made, and what processes did you put in place to get it right as you grew bigger? And the final one, at what point did you step away from doing all the individual hiring for every role?
I'm not sure I ever got it right. Well, in fact, I know I didn't get it right. So, I think we started the business again, as you have to, with a small. We didn't have any money, so a lot of the people we started were like-minded people. To begin with, we made a lot of our decisions by that sort of small management committee, and we grew that, and we did very well. What you realise quite quickly is you don't see, the cracks start to appear and things. We were still growing gangbusters, but we weren't sort of provisioning far enough ahead. I'm not ashamed to say that people management was never my strong point. Didn't realise it at the time, but I realise it now. So I never really did that, if I'm honest. And it took our board, candidly, to come and tap me on the shoulder and say, "You're not the right person to actually run this bit of it anymore," which is a pretty tough message to hear at the time. It was the right message, although I didn't realise it then. In terms of what now, what I do is funny because all the business I'm involved in now, I have a much better sense of what's happening. I don't think I just want to do it. It's easier to say than do. But it is that point about saying if you want to grow, and I always say to people, look, if you think you're going to grow at X% a month or a year or whatever, work out where your business will be in 2 years' time, and ask yourself, do you think these people you've got now are the right people to run that business? Because the timescales around hiring people, getting them in, it's sort of that order. So, when you're in hypergrowth, you realise that you are leaving your people behind almost the whole time, and you've just got to go right out there and try and find someone who's run a business. If you try and find someone who's running a business that's 10 times bigger than you, which seems a ridiculous amount bigger, well, we hit that number in under 2 years, and so it's just having the courage to look a long way forward. The other things are, as you outgrow people, don't be tempted to sort of compensate for the fact that they've reached their ceiling by adding someone, dividing their job in two and adding someone alongside them. We did that a bit too often. All that you do then is you have too many people and it becomes inefficient. If you've outgrown someone, doesn't mean to say they've done a bad job. It just means they've reached their ceiling. You have to just recognise that and upgrade them. And we didn't. I don't think we're unique in this, by the way. It's one of the hardest things about growing a business. But you have to try and stay ahead of that curve. And then the other one is, Andrin and I were talking about it earlier, when you get that sort of sickening feeling in your gut that someone's not quite working out, that feeling only gets worse. And as you start to get that feeling, you should listen to it pretty quickly and work out how you're going to deal with it, because the sooner you deal with it, the easier it will be to deal with.
Hi, thank you, Ed. That was fantastic. You talked about monitoring cash flow very carefully and this customer success metric of liquidity, which obviously also benefits the business. What are the things that people often asked you to look at that you make a conscious decision not to look at as metrics?
Crikey. Well, actually, one of the, dare I say it in a venture capital backed environment, but one of the advantages of just raising money from angels in the early days, they didn't ask us to look at anything. So we were free, therefore, to sort of learn it for ourselves. I don't know. I mean, we didn't look at, as I say, we didn't obsess about customer acquisition costs. We obsessed about that in the context of how quickly those people paid. I would have paid, gambling. Some of those customers are incredibly valuable customers. So to sort of say that actually we would happily spend £2,500 acquiring a customer, most people look at you as if you're mad. To be honest, there are plenty of customers for whom that would have been the most obvious thing to do, and we did. The other thing, I think, the other evil that we luckily dodged, and I'm not saying that we were asked to do it, but it's important, is that what I call the averaging out. Very easy to look at your environment across lots of people. You average the whole thing out together, and you sort of say we're doing very well. And you have to really sort of slice it down to say, okay, this bit's absolutely outperforming, but this bit's underperforming. And in a liquidity business, that really matters because of the sort of 80-20, or as we said, it's not 80-20, it's probably 95-5. So I don't think we ever didn't look at stuff. I mean, it was more okay. So we looked things that we thought were interesting for us. Sort of customer deposits. So how much money we had on deposit, because that was always a leading indicator, therefore, of what people would do. One of the things we realised very quickly is that we didn't want to give people an excuse to take their money out. So there's a real sense of inertia. So, we added peripheral products that were not. I mean, we hoped they would generate us money. Their real aim was to stop people moving somewhere else to use them. So, for example, we added games and we added casinos, bets and stuff like that, which was a move away from what we did in terms of purity, but it meant that people didn't have a reason to go and bet somewhere else, because once they'd taken their money away from us, it was going to be twice as hard to get it back. So, we focused on, that metric a lot. Like everyone, we focused on churn. We focused on sort of behaviour. We learnt a lot about how people used our site. I mean, one of the things was, we fundamentally, we took money in, we did something funny with it in the middle, and we gave money out. When you're dealing with someone's money, you've really got to get it right. And we saw lots of people who would put money in and then take it out straight away. So we obsessed about making sure that their first withdrawal, all their withdrawal processes were smooth and simple. And if anything went wrong, we were on to them before they knew about it. So they had real confidence in what we were doing. I mentioned earlier that we didn't take shortcuts. So, we were very, very overt. If we got something wrong, we fessed up and we basically, we wore it. We couldn't penalise customers for mistakes that we made. We just, I mean, I think it was just being very, very transparent. And that, particularly in the gambling industry, which, has for a long time had a a reputation of being a little bit murky. We deliberately set out to be different to that. It was the whole ethos of, a transparent platform, and we had to back that up with everything that we did.
I'd love to hear about your view of the future of the betting industry, and are there any innovations going on at the moment, either at startups or incumbent companies, that you think are going to shake up the market?
I'm sure there are. I mean, I left Betfair 5.5 years ago. I spent 13 years in the industry, and I don't miss it. And that's just, I was completely all in, excuse the gambling pun, on one particular business and one particular industry for a long period of time. And, it's a regulated industry. There were three of us who handled all that regulatory stuff, and thank God there were, because I don't think any of us could have done it on our own, because you'd have gone mad, because it was very frustrating. So I have sort of, I've got to be honest, the one class of investment I just don't look at all. I get sent a lot, and I never look at gambling investments, not least because I'm still a shareholder in Betfair. But look, I think, there will, of course, there will be innovation. I'm not, I don't know what that will be, but it will be two things. Well, the gambling industry does have to make sure it behaves in a responsible way. Funny enough, one of the things I was most proud of, one of the projects I was most proud about that we did at Betfair, nobody really knows about, and it was using data to manage potential problem gambling situations. And so the innovation can come in funny areas. So that one, we looked at people who developed, who asked to self-exclude or who developed a problem over a period of time, and we looked at all their historical usage, and we built a model of user behaviour, so that if someone now started to exhibit some of the signs that they had exhibited, let's say 3 years earlier, we won't ring them up and say, by the way, bad news, you're going to have a gambling problem, but we would we'd nudge them. So we'd put, we'd send them the emails about loss limits and stuff like that. So, there's a lot you can do with that. And that kind of innovation in a business has to be socially responsible. It's not just about how you generate the top revenue, it's about how you protect your brand and your reputation. And look, it's well documented at the moment that the gambling industry has some issues in terms of some of the products that it's using and how people's reaction to them, and I think they will face a bit of a regulatory backlash on some of that stuff. They have it in their power to be ahead of that curve, and the ones that succeed will be the ones that anticipate where regulation is going, help the regulator get there. I mean, again, we sat with a regulator and said, how can we help you regulate our industry? We were the first people that ever done that. And, anticipating how the market's going to be, even if it's not what you wanted to happen, and being there. So, in innovation in gambling, I mean, there will be. I think what social clearly comes in. I said that Flutter was probably ahead of its time in many ways. We tried numerous times to work out how we could make it a more social experience, and we never got it right. But somebody will crack that properly, and then different delivery platforms. But.
So asking about the future as well, do you think there's an opportunity to build a decentralized version of Betfair?
Yeah, I think there has to be. In the same way that you can build decentralized versions of lots of trading environments, and obviously with blockchain, that's where people are sort of moving. I think you've always got the trust element. So make no bones about it. Right, there are plenty of people who will try and abuse the system. We had plenty. We had fraudsters. We had people who would do sort of slightly underhand things. I was saying Andrin earlier, people who would deliberately put bets up where the decimal point was one place removed to make it look like it was an attractive bet, whereas in actual fact it was a very unattractive bet, and you have to close that loop, and it's a bit of an arms race the whole time. If you haven't got someone who's got a vested interest at the centre to sort of maintain the integrity of that marketplace, then that's the one thing I think you worry about. Now, I'm not smart enough to work out how that gets, and I'm sure it does do. Can you have a distributed and decentralized marketplace? Yes, of course you can. Regulation will always play a part there because there are plenty of countries in the world where they will say gambling is illegal, and however much someone might say yes, but we're not doing it here, we're doing it sort of everywhere. That argument will not. Well, it'll hold until you get picked up. It's happened to a guy in the US. Until you get picked up and stuck in a jail cell, and then you say, actually, yes, I am offering a gambling service. So. Whether people are able to find them, that's obviously the argument says, well, it will happen. The trust element, people always need to know that. And I think how you protect the bad actors in those environments is, what determines whether it works or not.
Thank you.
Maybe we move to the back in the interest of equality.
Hi, you said some of the other marketplaces that you've worked with since have different characteristics, such as Funding Circle. The two different sides are different. What are some of the things you've learned since Betfair in other marketplaces that either you wish you had have applied at Betfair, or you're perhaps pleased you didn't have to deal with at the time?
So the marketplace, so I've got 4 businesses that I'm sort of quite heavily involved in now. One is Funding Circle, where obviously SMEs borrowing from what starts as individuals and has now morphed. And again, in the same way as businesses move, you go from small individual, bet size wise, or investment size wise, to large individual. When does a large individual become a sort of small institution? When's an institution? So there's a continuum. I don't buy this argument that sort of goes from individual to, and then suddenly there's a step change. Which is why I think, by the way, that the P2P, which people think of as person-to-person, peer-to-peer, I think is a bad title for a lot of these businesses. I think liquidity and network type businesses are much better descriptor of. So, Funding Circle has the same thing. LMAX, which is an FX platform. Property Partner, which is again sort of doing the same thing in property, and then a thing called Prodigy Finance, which is student finance. All of those are sort of liquidity businesses. The network effects probably differ to some degree. I think again what I learnt. So take LMAX for example. I mean, you have to have the best. You have to have the best product and the sort of best platform. Because eventually that one wins out. So whether that is fastest, most robust. Trust is a huge impact. It is a huge thing on all of these. So I think it's not. I don't think I've learned anything. I thought, gosh, I'm glad we didn't have to do that in Betfair. I mean, probably the one thing is I didn't realise that we were very lucky that we didn't have to differentiate between 2 different classes of customer. But most of the things I would say are similar. Understanding how the network builds, understanding the stresses on the network, when to raise the thresholds, again, that sort of vertical versus horizontal. It manifests itself in different ways, but I think that's a really, really important thing. And understanding, you're all in sort of liquidity-based businesses, understanding what your critical mass point is and what your tipping point is, and sort of, being confident that when you get past that, are you then done completely, or is then another one further on, and really working towards those. That was a discipline that we had, that we learned at Betfair, and I've now shared with those other businesses. Say, look, you've got to get to that level, and when you get there, then you can sort of reassess.
I think there was a question just behind you.
Thanks. You talk quite a lot about market share, but you also mentioned that for your sort of top of the pyramid customers, their needs weren't really being met by the existing betting shops. To what extent do you feel like you actually created that market as opposed to taking market share? And assuming that is the case, how did you then measure market share in a market that you're effectively creating?
So I talk about relative market share, and i.e. how much bigger I am than the next person. And the way I always argue that is, if I'm 51% market share, that might be great, but if there's one other participant and they're 49, then I'm in a hell of a slugfest. If I'm 10% market share, but in actual fact the next biggest person is 2, then actually I effectively control it. So we knew that a lot of the people at the top of the range just could go nowhere else because no bookmaker would take them. So when we focused on our market share metrics, our relative market share metrics, we were really looking in the environment of businesses that those people could go to. So, we didn't try and factor in how much Ladbrokes and William Hill and people like that were doing. We obviously kept close tabs on them, but we didn't obsess about it in the same way as we obsessed about understanding, what BetDAC or a business called Sporting Options that went under and those kind of things did. So we used to just measure that. We had a bot that just ran the whole time, so we could see, how we were doing. Do I think we created business? Absolutely. So I know that, a lot of the guys who came to us, the only place they could bet before that were on the totalizators because they were non-risk platforms. Those people have moved into other sports, which they absolutely couldn't do before. So, we have definitely created business there. I also know that we've got people who've never bet before. People out of the city who were very good at algo trading and very good at data analysis and basically wrote bots to just run these things. So, yes, we've grown the market, but still within that market, you just look at how much we're doing. And that's why actually it's not market share. You need to know how big the market is. Relative market share, you don't. And relative market just says, where am I compared to my next competitor or the one above?
And did you worry about what the size of that market could be? Did you try and figure out how did you go about that?
If I'm honest, no. Just because, we had enough other things to worry about, and it wasn't something I could really change and affect. I mean, got to be careful what I say here, but that's, people worry about the market size a lot when they're, in investment mode and they're trying to pitch for money. We realised it was a very big market. We realised that, if we got to the stage where we'd exhausted that market, then we'd sort of think about it then. And that probably was a bit naive, but we've still got a long way to go until we exhaust it.
Thanks.
Thank you, first of all, for sharing these insights. What was one hard decision that you didn't take and you wish you had taken, and what was the learning from that?
Okay, very good question. The obvious ones that I should have taken were people related. And I've touched on it, that I was, pretty awful at that, I'm going to be honest. And I recognise now that I should have been upgrading the whole time, the team. And, and candidly, brilliant team of people that we started it with, it's outgrown all of us, literally all of us. And so, at some stage you have to, I should have addressed that earlier. Probably, again, another one would have been just in the early days of tech when we still had to buy servers and invest lots of money. I mean, I often sort of think what it would be like to run our business in the cloud, where we could just sort of dial up more capacity when we needed it and turn it off when we didn't. We were probably a little bit conservative then in terms of pushing. I remember when we did the Flutter deal, we wrote what we thought was a very large check at the time to buy new servers, and we bought them, and we needed to buy new ones again sort of in about 3 months' time. And that was, so just having the boldness to sort of go further, I guess. Part of that was driven by, having raised a tiny amount of money and just, I guess we'd only ever run the business in that slightly sort of, stingy way. And it was quite hard to break out of that. So that was probably, but undoubtedly the one, if I had my time again, I would like to think I could make better decisions on people. I'm not sure I could, but I would certainly seek more help and, input on doing it.
Great. I think we're way past our allocated time already. So, Ed, thank you very much
Pleasure.
for
Thank you.
sharing your insights.